In this video, I'm going to be showing you how I replaced some rotted exterior brick mold as well as a rotted door jamb. You could see over time this door has kind of settled because it wasn't hung very well. You'll see later in the video the framing's not great and the door had sagged, which had caused it to be catching on the sill, and eventually because it was catching on the sill and the fact that the exterior brick mold and even started part of that framing, the jamb was rotted, the sill completely came out, and that was kind of at the point where I decided this had to be taken care of. It was one of those projects that was on the to-do list for a while. Basically, by the time I started foaming, I'd already removed all the brick mold, which had been capped with aluminum, which I'm not a huge fan of. This is that aluminum capping I also removed. This is what I'm replacing it with, which is a plastic composite, which is going to be a J channel with brick mold integrated into it, so it's one unit. And this is the header that was above the door, completely rotted, that was covered with aluminum. I pulled all that stuff off to kind of gauge the damage, and at that point was when I decided that it was going to be worth it to just completely replace the whole jambs and rehang the door. I'm actually happy I decided to do that because you'll see in the video I discovered this mess, which is where the connection between the door and the brick is, which probably attributed to the fact that the door over time started to sag. You could see the bottom of that. The jambs are rotted. I don't think it's a terrible repair to cut those out and replace them with new lumber, but like I said, this whole area was enough of a mess. I decided to just completely take that out and deal with it. So the OSB that's on the outside of the house, just in this one corner, was also rotted, so I pulled all that off. The outside was cladded with aluminum siding. I tried to remove as little of that as possible. I kind of found when I hung the French doors on this house that stuff is a pain and it's not easy to replace. So I try not to mess with it too much. And then that was when this corner stud, it became pretty evident that it had to be replaced. I have worked on this room before. If you watch the channel, you saw I framed out and hung some French doors in place of a window on the other side of the room. So I already kind of knew going into it that there was some questionable DIY work or just cheap labor work done on this room. But this beam in the corner didn't have a sill plate, and it was only attached to that brick wall with one masonry fluted nail, and it wasn't even attached that well. So I was pretty happy. I decided to take out that whole corner. I'm going to be replacing it and anchoring it properly to the wall, and now the door itself just functions much better. This side of the door where the framing is wasn't super compromised, but once again there is no sill plate, so the bottoms of these were rotted enough that I decided to just cut those out and shove a pressure treated 2x4 in there, put a bunch of adhesive on it so it sticks nicely, and that was all I was going to do for this corner. So you could see I pretty much just used a saw and a shim to get the height I needed. I cut a pressure treated 2x4 to fit in there. I'm using a couple different caulking materials, and for this one's called Quad. It's kind of an all-around exterior glue / caulk / weatherproofing. Put a bunch of that on there and shoved it under there, and then that side was done. For this side, I'm obviously going to have to build up some depth because of the piece I moved was an older 4x4, so it was a little over 3.5 inches wide, and also you're going to want double studs over here anyway. The first stud I put in place, you could see I put a sill plate over here as well. I anchored that with multiple masonry anchors to the wall as well as some Tapcons, and then built that out as well. So at this point that inner portion was completely reframed and solid at this point. Like I said, the 4x4, before I even removed it, you could shake the entire thing. So then all I did was I bought this jamb kit at Lowe's. It's pre-primed, which is nice, so I don't have to get about painting it as fast as you normally would. They're going to come oversized, so this was an easy job in the sense since I was removing a door and replacing it with the exact same door. All I did was pull measurements off of the frame I pulled out. It was a little questionable at the bottom because the bottom was so rotted I couldn't get a proper height, so I had to go off of the door and kind of calculate that. but for the top part of the jamb was really easy. I just cut it down to size. This was one of those pre-hung doors that you buy at Home Depot. It still had the sticker on it, which means that all of that was not DIY'd, so all of the measurements off of the jamb were going to be accurate. So once I cut the two sides down, you could see I had to saw that angle for the sill in place, and then I'm obviously going to have to put hinges on here as well, hinge mortises for the hinges. Once again, very simple process because I'm just using the old jamb. I lined them up, marked where those hinges go. I didn't even make a jig for this. I just put some painter's tape. I didn't even use double-sided tape on this to kind of shim out where and line up where that mortise needed to be, and then I could go through with a pattern cutting bit and make that mortise for those hinges. So there's 3 of them. You could see it's just painter's tape. I would just move it down the line. They're just lined up with the pencil marks I had on there, and then the hinges fit right into place. So at this point, I'm at the tail end of about 1 day's worth of work. Stuff like this is unfortunate because obviously you're trying to get the door rehung before the day ends. So I was kind of rushing at this point. And then I could just use this Vicks bit, which is a lifesaver with hinges, to pre-drill those for when I hang the door. If you watch the French door video, you know I kind of sealed all of the jambs I made with epoxy. Didn't really have time to let epoxy set up, so I used some Lexol caulking, and in the corners that is also a weatherproofing caulking / glue, and that will keep all of the water out of that joint. You could spread it on the end grain there and make a nice joint. So I do recommend doing stuff like that before screwing this together. I had this all dry fitted. Putting that caulking in the corner is just going to help keep water out. And then the sill was the exact width it needed to be. I didn't have to cut that down at all. So same thing, I'm using some of this Lexol caulking in the corners, and then I'll reinforce it with a couple of screws. And like I said, it was a prefab door, and I'm replacing it with prefab parts, so this does go together really quickly, which was kind of nice in this circumstance. And then I'm just testing to make sure that this fits, which it did. Testing to make sure the jambs fit in place, and then I'm going to put this in place as well. Now I used some quad tape on the bottom sill there because this is tile here, and then what I'm putting it on is concrete. I didn't put any sort of metal flashing or anything like that, just used the flashing tape, and then I put a ton of adhesive before I set this door in place, and I could just kind of prop it in place. Now this video is not really going to cover shimming out the door and getting everything flush, because like I said, I was running out of time at that point. It's kind of outside the scope of this. I'm focusing more on fixing up the outside, but all I did was shim it in place. Keep repeating this prefab door that's going in the exact same opening almost, but with a new side, so everything fit in there pretty nicely. And then I could just go through, I put that low expansion foam around the whole door to seal everything up. Could go through and take all that off. Now the outside, it would have been easier to get the door in place if I had done this before I put the door in, but time restraints, I was rushing, forgot to do it. So the first thing I did on the outside was cut a piece of OSB and replace that piece I took off. What I'm adding to this build, which most likely wasn't super popular when this door was hung, is some flashing tape around all of the sides so water can't get in between any of this wood. It really just kind of seals everything up and really keeps that water out of there. So then that is flashing tape around the whole piece, and then I could start using this integrated Brickmold J-channel around the vinyl siding. Now I was really trying to not remove this vinyl siding because it's a pain to take off and put back in place, and it kinks really easily. I'm sure there's places to buy this, but it's going to be expensive and hard to source. So for the top part, I was able to just kind of pull that top piece away from the house, put a piece of vinyl trim underneath of this as well, because basically this brick mold has to go to meet where the vinyl siding was cut. It's a little too far off my jamb, so I added a piece of vinyl trim. You can kind of see that at the top of the door. And then once I got the top in place, I could go and put that vinyl siding back in place. Now, the flashing tape I have is on top of my reveal line, so this was really easy to mark my measurements for all of my cuts. All I had to do was line everything up on top of that flashing tape, and then I knew where my marks were. So once again, I added that vinyl trim siding on the side of the jamb, and then I could go put that brick mold up there, mark it, and cut it. And then, like I said, I was trying not to remove this stuff, but I ended up taking off most of this side wall, and I could just reattach that. The top one, obviously, you're not going to be able to put nails into, so if you just kind of work yourself in there with that. I was using a chisel to kind of push up that flange because it's a lip it catches on, and then I could use a rubber mallet to kind of hammer down the lip, and it did end up catching, and once it was all back in place, it wasn't too bad. You see I'm using some blue tape in my mitered corners to hold everything together, and then on this side it was the exact same thing. So I just measured and cut, and it looks like it's a wide gap there, but the gap between the new brick mold I'm putting up and the brick is quite small, so using a hammer in there was a little bit of a challenge, but I was able to get that in place. All in all, this is a DIY-able job, I think, with a little bit of gumption, and it needed to be done. You could see how rotted it was. So in order to finish this up, I'm using two types of caulking. I'm using 100% silicone where the brick meets the siding. That's what was there. The person that did this before slapped caulking all over the place. When that sort of thing happens, really the only way forward is to caulk on top of it. The proper way to have done this would have put a piece of J-channel there for the vinyl siding to dead end into, but I didn't want to have to go all the way up the wall. You could see where my caulking stops and the older caulking stops. Believe it or not, even though it's a mess, it actually matches. You can't really see it when it's in that little corner anyway. And then all around the doors, around the trim, and where the brick mold meets, I'm using a paintable, it's like a hybrid silicone, because this is the wood there's only primed, so I could go back and paint all of this. But basically I decided to film this. I don't like that aluminum capping. It works great until water gets in there, and then because it's aluminum, the water gets in there, condensates, and just creates a mess, completely rots it away. So hopefully this will save someone the trouble of having to do that. You also need a brake to bend it, which is expensive, and that is what it looks like now. So quick, little, easy. I think this took all in all 2 days and a couple nights.